Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. A federal judge in the United States refused to suspend President Donald Trump's recent executive order that put a 60-day ban on green cards for most immigrants due to the coronavirus crisis. Trump's order came last week after he vowed that he'd halt immigration to the United States during the COVID-19 crisis. But in the end, he limited the order to a 60-day freeze on most green cards while still allowing visa processing for hundreds of thousands of temporary employees like farm workers and crop pickers who make up the majority of immigrants in the US. Elsewhere, as a result of the pandemic, many other countries too have implemented restrictions on entry and exit, visa and work permit issuance, closed borders, tightened quarantine rules, and taken other measures to protect themselves. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the way forward for immigration. Joining me on the program today are Jitendra Nath Mishra, former ambassador, Professor Swaran Singh, Chairperson, Center for International Politics, JNU, and Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, let me begin the program with you. First, let's talk about, or let's analyze how COVID-19 has impacted immigration as a whole.
Well, the impact is obvious. As you yourself said, most countries have put immigration bans or immigration restrictions to a large measure. And talking of the United States, however, you started with the US. Let me just go back a little further to 2006. Actually, I was just doing some research today, and I found that there's been a 25% cut in visas issued between 2016 and 2019. This was before the coronavirus crisis. So what's happening? There's populism, there's politics, there is an election coming up later this year. So President Trump, his election manifesto very clearly talked about curbs on immigration. And that was implemented, as I just said, 25% cuts in 3 years before the coronavirus crisis, which is interesting. It's an indicator. So I would rather see things as evolving as far as the United States, and I would think also, as far as most of the world is concerned, the world has gone protectionist to a larger extent than before. Globalism was not in fashion before the coronavirus crisis, and Europe is fortress Europe. I worked in Portugal. I knew how it was in Europe, and you had to really, the only people who were allowed really with ease were people who paid a lot of money to invest and got the visas, things like that. Now you had the Prime Minister of Hungary recently saying that foreigners have brought the virus. So there is a persecution of foreigners. It's happening all over the world. And immigration is greatly reduced. And it's in disarray. And economies are in disarray. So therefore, I would say that this is a process that has been accelerated by the coronavirus crisis. This is not a process that began with the coronavirus crisis. Now, as far as the ramifications are concerned, I am not a pessimist, but I would rather say that look at world history. We've had so many pandemics before. We had the plague in medieval Europe. You must have seen Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, the great film. Now, the plague wipes out 1/3 of Europe. What happens? It ushers in a kind of a golden age in Europe, actually, paradoxically. The Reformation, the Renaissance, all that happens because the old ways of looking at reality, the world around us, change. And new things come up, and you have to have a survival strategy. I dare say, and I hope, God forbid, that this crisis is not something like that. And I hope it never will be. But it will certainly set in some changes. But I'm not, as I said, a pessimist. But where is the international cooperation? We know what we have to do, like healthcare. We know what we have to do in healthcare. We know what we have to do to stimulate economies. But I will stop at this point so that you can continue the conversation with the other friends.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. So, let me take this particular issue forward with you, Captain Bansal. This issue of protectionism. Do you believe at some level that the world is getting far more protectionist going forward?
See, there is no doubt. For some time, we have been saying that globalization had was being reversed. We saw in many of the Western countries, especially with Trump coming to power in US and in many European countries also, there was steps against globalization. People were going back. There was a retreat. But as far as the current policies of immigration are concerned, there are two issues which I want to highlight. Firstly, the Trump's order is now a temporary order, 60-day order for halting immigration. Firstly, during these 60 days, we have a world which is hardly connected. There are no flights. Most of the countries have stopped flights. There are no flights. Economic activity has come to a grinding halt. The immigration was primarily to boost economies, to get involved into the economic activities. When the economy has stopped, when there is no connectivity, the immigration obviously takes a little backseat, because those who justified immigration, because immigration in countries like US was essential for their economic sustenance. If they had to grow at a certain level, that certain amount of immigration was essential for United States. That had been the premise. Of course, Trump's policies have a very significant political backdrop. We need to understand how Trump has handled COVID-19, because he initially trivialized the threat, then actually procrastinated. And now when the full impact has hit the United States, he has to divert attention, take his core support bank together. And that's how you are seeing this sort of steps that are taking place. To my mind, this is actually a sad part, that we are seeing protectionism actually on the rise. We must endeavor, because to my mind, it is in India's interest to go for a greater globalization. We have certain strengths, and that will come to its full as and when the globalization process continues, because we are a big country with a huge population, a large workforce, and certain inherent advantages which allows us a certain benefits if there is a globalization.
Absolutely. So let me take another point forward with you. Since we are talking about the United States, before we move on to the other countries, Professor Swaran Singh, do you believe that a lot of what President Trump has announced and the President Trump's measures over the last few weeks are concerned, especially this whole issue of the 60-day immigration ban, it's all based on basically the elections later this year, and his eye is clearly on that?
There is no doubt there are some of these immediate triggers to his initiatives, whether his constant criticism of China or criticism of World Health Organization, or is this high shrill noise about immigrants, providing jobs, protecting jobs, American citizens. These are immediate triggers, and of course would have an eye on the election year. But there are also deeper undercurrents, currents which are pushing his policy, which we must understand, because it is those undercurrents which are going to sustain these kind of policies and behavior in developed world. So what we are noticing here is that there is a certain pushback to this whole globalization, at least in the developed world, and this has coincided with what we call the rise of the right. And you can see it across countries, one after another. And these parties, one after another, typically have a very conservative policies on immigration, on refugees. And you can notice one country after another, the policies have changed in how to deal with refugees and immigrants. And that is a fundamental contradiction, because even of United States, if you see, much of their software, IT technology on the West Coast is run by immigrants. I'm told 1/3 of people in Silicon Valley are not born in the United States, they're immigrants. But the point which we often keep missing is that bulk of the agro industries in the United States are also run by immigrants. And nearly half of them are what is called undocumented immigrants, who get a very shoddy treatment. In fact, historically, go back to colonial times when this whole immigration of labor started with sugarcane plantations. Immigrants have always got a shoddy deal in all countries, given low wages, given difficult and dangerous jobs to perform. And they have built these economies. And now it seems the political aristocracy or kleptocracy actually is emerging in a very myopic kind of focus and is criticizing immigration. But when it comes to COVID, I think you can notice that one after another, and you gave example of Trump making exceptions, stopping immigration in terms of visas for limited number of categories for 60 days. Worst is what you see what European countries are doing. They're breaching their own border ceilings. Countries are charting flights and sending to other countries. For example, Italy, which is in news. Roughly 2 million people are above 80 years of age there, and that means they need at least equal or larger number of caregivers. And this unification of Europe has created enormous influx of East Europeans into West Europe. So these societies, not just economies, cannot exist minus these immigrants into those countries. Therefore, these are clearly myopic policies, politically driven, and will not stand for a long term. In the long run, it will not be really effective.
Okay, all right. Let's take the discussion forward then, Ambassador. So, what measures have governments around the world taken really as far as immigration is concerned? And also, we've discussed a few of them already over the last 10 minutes or so. Are you afraid that many of these measures are going to stay?
Well, as Dr. Sorensen said, at some stage they're going to give rather than stay. He just said that. Because the economies are so intertwined, so interdependent. Look at the NHS in the UK. The NHS, theoretically, if all the doctors and all the caregivers in the health system suddenly decided to go, it would just collapse. Of course, it's not going to happen because they would not go, and the British would not let them go because they are dependent on them. So there is a kind of symbiotic relationship of mutual dependence out here. The same in the United States. Why were the farm workers exempt from the immigration curbs? Because they produce. Without food, this is the basic human need. So without that, you can't go on. And President Trump has gone on record as saying that they are exempt. So that kind of thing. And in Europe, I was in Portugal. They had something called a golden visa. You pay €500,000 euros and you get a golden visa, which is a visa for life. Now, these are the kinds of dependencies that you create. And don't forget that the best entrepreneurs in the world are immigrants. Historically, if you look at the statistics, some of the best, most innovative people, well, the USA is a country of migrants, of people. Every American traces his roots to some country over the last 3 or 4 centuries, to some country that's not the United States, except the indigenous people, who unfortunately are very marginalized. So who are these creative people? Where does the US creativity come from? I worked there. I taught in Georgetown University, and most of the faculty had either a first or second generation migrant coming from another country. Lots of them came from Europe, some of their scientists. So the world is what it is. The world is not what we imagine it to be, and the world is certainly not going to be what we think we can manipulate it into during an election year. You can do it to some extent, but you can't do it to a great extent, whether it's the United States or any other country. So therefore, while these curbs will be there, they will be more temporary than permanent. As I said, in the US, the tendency was always there, and Mr. Bansal also said that a little while ago about the protectionism in the United States. And I think this will outlive the crisis. So I see the crisis as a continuum in a historical process in that sense. Now, we are getting very scared. We are terrified of this virus because we don't know what it's getting at, where we are going in, what we are going into. But we have had so many pandemics before. So I don't think there is a need to panic. We have to take the precautions. We have to improve our healthcare. I'm just going beyond immigration, if I may, a little bit. Healthcare. And can it be a wake-up call? Can we improve our environment? Look at me. I used to, till yesterday, sit in the garden in the downstairs. We are allowed to go downstairs within the compound. And you hear the birds chirping at 5 or 6 in the morning. You see all kinds of birds. You see the beautiful blue sky, and you breathe the clean, fresh air. Now, this wasn't the case 2 months back or 1 month back. So this is in our hands to change our fate. So will there be a realization in our great India? We call the Ganges is suddenly very clean. The Himalayas can be seen from 200 kilometers. Miracles. And right. I think we have to think about these things. So
it could be a turning point, really, as far as our generation is concerned, is what you're suggesting, and how we turn this around really is in our hands, and which way we want to take it is also, or what direction we want to give it is really in our hands, is what you're suggesting.
Absolutely, and each one of us can be the change by looking at it differently. Use less water, for example. Turn off the tap when you are not needing the water. Just do simple things. So
Okay.
if we can, I think the poor people are beginning to be aware of that, the less educated people.
Right.
Thank
All right. So the future is in our hands. Let's make it right, is what the ambassador is suggesting. All right, Captain Batsa. Moving on from there now. So let's talk about what happens to the movement of labor and what happens to the movement of professionals now going forward.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment for two, three things. I just want to take on from where Ambassador left. Firstly, what he said that there are so many unintended good which has happened. And I think this is where I think we were already heading towards green technologies. I think this pandemic has given a quantum shift as far as going green is concerned. The second point is what he said was that earlier also there were pandemics. We did not react in this manner. Now, this is which is very important. There were earlier pandemics, but we did not have a world that was so well connected, so good at information technology. The fact is, the last major pandemic, the Spanish flu, was called Spanish flu, though it did not originate in Spain. Because Spain was not participating in the World War, there was a free press. The press reported in Spain. The other belligerents did not report because there was press censorship. So this is how much information matters. Since this is an information age, people are connected, people are connected with each other, and this is what is happening. As far as movement of labor is concerned, I think it will revive, but it will take time because, as you know, the global economy is not going to get back onto the rail immediately. The IMF has forecasted that this particular year that is coming, other than India and China, every other global economy would be in negative recession. So if only two countries, where do the people go? Because we have already seen Indian labor goes in a large number to Middle East. Already you have UAE asking countries to take back their labor. And we have countries like Saudi Arabia, which are in great recession because the oil prices have come down. So as far as labor movement is concerned, it is dependent on economy. I don't think so economy is actually reviving immediately. Firstly, we don't know when this pandemic will come under control because this is still a matter of big question mark. Because till the first virus actually is successful, cleared for mass production, we can only hope. And we are trying to do our best by flattening the curve by actually staying indoors. Now, with this sort of lockdown, the economy is definitely not going to get a boost. So till the time the economy doesn't revive, I don't think so that sort of mass movement of labor you will see. In fact, we are not even sure when the normal flights will revive. It is still a question mark whether it will be in mid-May, end May, June. So once the flights revive, then only you can start looking at as far as movement is concerned. And that too, if there is an economic activity that gets revived. As of now, there is a huge downturn. So to my mind, labor movement is inevitable as and when the economy gets back onto the trail. But when it will get back onto the trail, I don't think so in this financial year. It will happen only probably next financial year or year after that. So it's a long hiatus that we are going to see before things return to as they were. So I think in that sort of a scenario, we have no other option but to do. I think what Trump has sanctified by making a statement is already a de facto reality globally. Nobody is going to allow immigration at this stage. There are no flights. How do you allow? Visas are banned. There is no economic activity taking place. How will people? But Trump, for his electoral reasons, as I've always said, that since he was on a back foot, he had to actually marshal his core constituency. He has come out with this sort of a statement. That is primarily an electoral statement. But as I said, immigration is going to stop because there's going to be no economic activity. There's no going to be any much movement of people from one place to another. And that is the reason. So I guess till things normalize, we will have to bear with it.
Okay, all right. So, let me draw your attention to another aspect, Professor Swaran Singh. The ILO has said that nearly 50% of the global workforce is at risk of losing their livelihood. So it's no rocket science really to assume that it is the immigrants who are going to suffer the most when it comes to this.
Exactly. I think having lived in what Ambassador described as a kind of utopian Shangri-La for 4 weeks, this is not sustainable. That the complete lockdown of activity is not possible. So we will have soon again the same, cogs of machines moving, pollution coming back, some of the rivers getting polluted again. But that's the model we have followed. I mean, that's the dominant industrial model that we all around the world have followed now, which in a lighter vein people say pushes us to buy things that we do not need with money that we do not have. And that's a mad pursuit of GDP growth rates, which we have been pushing over a period of time. And that seems to be an unstoppable juggernaut. So I'm sure we will go back to that when and how fast. As Captain Bansal said, it will take a little longer time. I understand two things. One, many of these workforce, in case of India, have moved back to villages. But that's not how it is in developed world. They're not moving back to Shangri-Las of villages and forests. They are moving actually from one country to another country in case of Europe. And that's very different example than example that we have in India, where people could stay longer in the villages. Economies there can sustain them for a little longer period of time. But in case of Europe, for example, people are going back as jobless, as stigmatized, as potential infection takers, as somebody who's shedding virus. And then, of course, many of them, use that occasion of freedom of movement being allowed at a certain point in time. Many of them are in what is called no man's land. And that is the tragedy, because in no man's land, they don't have any of the advantages of social security in any country because they're not citizens there. And social security packages, whether it is United States or in Europe, are addressing primarily the citizens. And I think it is interesting that you brought up this focus on immigrants, because we are talking of people who are infected, people who are sort of, recovered. We are talking of industry having the hit. There's a whole enormous class of immigrants, which is actually the movers and shakers of economic life. And they're not just in manufacturing sector, they are in mining, they are in agriculture, in all sectors. And no economy can ever recover unless and until they come back and begin pushing those things. And I think mega cities will be the first to realize that limitation. Of course, to some extent, we will also move to doing things from home, doing things online, putting more focus on green economy, green technology. But that's not how the bulk of world economy works. And if world economy has to really regerminate certain momentum, it is the same workforce of millions of people who have to come back. And you can see some desperate action. Recently, Spain, for example, had a royal decree to invite 150,000 workers who are undocumented, no questions asked. Similarly, you have Italy passing another law, inviting about 200,000 people. You have Germany, waiving all employment provisions to, allow day work for people who are, undocumented. So many countries, one could go on giving these examples. They, in middle of the COVID-19, are realizing that livelihood and life have to go together. And in their cases, with large number of old age people, they need caregivers. In addition to people in industry, you can close industry for few days, but you cannot stop caregivers in these countries. And there are very large number of caregivers, or we're not just talking of restaurants and other places. So this force you will notice, come in jerks. Countries will take desperate decisions over a period of time and then maybe step back. So we will keep seeing up and down happening, just as we will also keep seeing ups and downs happening in case of infections rising, infections falling, infections rising again and falling. In that sense, this chaos is going to continue for some amount of time, but it's not that economy will decelerate and then accelerate over a period of time. We will see several ups and downs in this period of time. And I think gradually we might either find the vaccine or herd community, which possibly will solve this crisis. And we'll find some way of surviving. As Ambassador said, we have survived several pandemics before in history. We will survive. But connectivity is very different. Our projecting of future scenarios is very different. Our access to vaccine is different. India's, medicines are going world over now. So in that sense, that connectivity is also positive. So in that sense, what I'm saying fundamentally is a lot of ups and downs and not simple deceleration and acceleration is what we are going to see. And immigrants will be playing a major role in how that happens.
All right. So we will prevail. We will survive. We might not see a lot of consistency going forward. Chaos could be the new normal, at least in the immediate near future, is what you're suggesting. Time now to get quick closing comments from all my guests with the best way forward, starting first with you, Ambassador.
Well, the best way forward is something to me utopian, which is international cooperation. Is it happening? No. President Trump called it the China virus. And like the Spanish flu, which I learned it didn't originate in Spain. Actually, it was something made up in the media. Now, it was called the Wuhan virus, then it was called the China virus, and the Chinese have the report is that it's an American conspiracy against the world. So there is bickering going on, and the WHO is, it's siding with China more or less in a way, because it has praised China. It has not sided with the United States point of view, rightly or wrongly. I'm not taking a point of view on that, but that's what the reality is. We have done whatever we could regionally through SAARC, but even here, we did not have unanimity. We had consensus. But one country misused this forum and this idea to score some brownie points on Kashmir. You know that. So this power play, unfortunately, is going to hinder any real sustained effort at international cooperation, because unfortunately the international system only recognizes the victor's justice.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Very well said there by the ambassador. Best way forward, Alok Bansal?
Well, as I said, the first requirement for best way forward is that we need to curtail this pandemic fast. Because if we don't curtail it, I think there is no best way forward. Anything that has to be done can only be done once this pandemic is under control. And I think once it is controlled, we must go for international cooperation to revive globalization. As I said, globalization is in the interest, because the developed world, which was earlier propagating globalization, having attained a certain level of comfort, is now actually trying to backtrack. That is what has been the scenario all through. The countries, developed countries, have exploited the environment, have exploited the climate, and then they want to go green. So that's been the prerogative. I think we must now, as I see this particular pandemic will create a new world order to a very great extent. Whether we like it or not, what it will be difficult to say. It depends on how it gets controlled, what it happens. And once that new world order comes, I think we'll have to renegotiate our terms of movement, of freedom of goods, freedom of services. I think a new trade regime, a new movement regime would have to be evolved. And then probably, I think, immigration is inevitable. Of course, as I said, you can see the numbers for yourself, the coronavirus, the lakhs and lakhs of people who are dying in Europe. Obviously, there's going to be a huge vacuum. Once the economic activity revives in Europe, in the West, you would need immigrants who would have to come and do the work. As you said, talked about caregivers, you talked about businesses. There are so many fields where there will be a vacancy. I think those vacancies will have to be filled by the immigrants, because the fact is that the birth rate in European and the Western countries is not good enough for replacement levels. So they are below replacement levels. So obviously, if the working population has to be maintained, and if a certain level of economic activity has to be sustained, you would require a certain level of immigration that will have to come.
Right.
So I think it is inevitable. When, how, it will depend purely on the fact as to how and when do we control the pandemic, because the new world order that emanates after that will dictate how the problem is resolved.
Absolutely. And Professor, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Thank you. I think the countries may be temporarily paranoid, angry with one another, taking myopic decisions, but they have all begin to realize, and they will very soon, that connectivity is irreversible. I come from education sector, so for example, American education system will collapse in case this paranoia continues, because 34% of students in those universities are sent by China, the country that is on the target of President Trump right now. About 18% plus students go from India. So that connectivity, I think, is not escapable, despite all the anger that Captain Bansal just described, how visas have been going down because of this anti-immigration policies of President Trump. Last year, United States alone issued about 500,000 visas.
Right.
So, numbers huge that we are talking of, and the connectivity will continue, except I agree with what was just now said. Certain recalibration will happen after, as and when we see post-COVID situation. I don't know when. Certain recalibration will happen where certain countries would have advantage, which, for example, countries like India have a lot of younger people, which will help them to sort of provide momentum again. And that is the basis where IMF has recently said that India and China will be the only countries where positive growth is likely because of young population. both to withstand in terms of their immunity vis-a-vis the pandemic, but also to come back and contribute to sort of momentum in economy. So some recalibration of international system will happen as and when, I don't know when, but as and when post-COVID world order emerges, I think some new space for new aspirant nations will be made, and then that recalibration is something which is, I think, going to be seen. And it may be painstaking for some who don't want to give that space, but that is what, again, they have to realize that connectivity is irreversible, and new aspirant and claimants will have to be accommodated in the new world order.
Okay, all right. On that note, then I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.